The Story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton by Charles Dickens. In an old abbey town, down in this part of the country, a long, long while ago, so long that the story must be a true one because our great-grandfathers implicitly believed it, there officiated as sexton and gravedigger in the churchyard one Gabriel Grubb. Gabriel Grubb was an ill-conditioned, cross-grained, surly fellow, a morose and lonely man who consorted with nobody but himself and an old wicker bottle which fitted into his large, deep waistcoat pocket. A little before twilight, one Christmas Eve, Gabriel shouldered his spade, lighted his lantern, and betook himself towards the old churchyard, for he had got a grave to finish by next morning. As he went his way up the ancient street, he saw the cheerful light of the blazing fires gleam through the old casements and heard the loud laugh and cheerful shouts of those who were assembled around him. All this was gall and wormwood to the heart of Gabriel Grubb, and when groups of children bounded out of the houses, Gabriel smiled grimly and clutched the handle of his spade with a firmer grasp as he thought of measles, scarlet fever, thrush, whooping cough, and a good many other sources of consolation besides. In this happy frame of mind, Gabriel strode along until he turned into the dark lane which led to the churchyard. Now, Gabriel had been looking forward to reaching the dark lane because it was a nice, gloomy, mournful place. Consequently, he was not a little indignant to hear a young urchin roaring out some jolly song about Merry Christmas in this very sanctuary, which had been called Coffin Lane ever since the days of the old abbey and the time of the shaven-headed monks. Gabriel waited until the boy came up and then dodged him into a corner and rapped him over his head with his lantern 5 or 6 times to teach him to modulate his voice. And as the boy hurried away with his hand to his head, singing quite a different sort of tune, Gabriel Grubb chuckled very heartily to himself and entered the churchyard, locking the gate behind him. He took off his coat, put down his lantern, and getting into the unfinished grave, worked at it for an hour or so with right good will. Brave lodgings for one, brave lodgings for one, a few feet of cold earth when life is done, a stone at the head, a stone at the feet, a rich juicy meal for the worms to eat, rank grass overhead and damp clay around, brave lodgings for one, these in holy ground. Ha ha ha! A coffin at Christmas! A Christmas box! Ho ho ho! Ho ho ho! Repeated a voice which sounded close behind him. Gabriel paused in some alarm, in the act of raising the wicker bottle to his lips, and looked around. The bottom of the oldest grave about him was not more still and quiet than the churchyard in the pale moonlight. The cold hoarfrost glistened on the tombstones and sparkled like rows of gems among the stone carvings of the old church. The snow lay hard and crisp upon the ground and spread over the thickly strewn mounds of earth, so white and smooth, a cover that it seemed as if corpses lay there hidden only by their winding sheets. Not the faintest rustle broke the profound tranquility of the solemn scene. Sound itself appeared to be frozen up. All was so cold and still. "It was the echoes," said Gabriel Grubb, raising the bottle to his lips again. "It was not," said a deep voice. Gabriel started up and stood rooted to the spot with astonishment and terror, for his eyes rested on a form that made his blood run cold. Seated on an upright tombstone close to him was a strange and unearthly figure whom Gabriel felt at once was no being of this world. His long, fantastic leg, which might have reached to the ground, were cocked up and crossed after a quaint, fantastic fashion. His sinewy arms were bare, and his hands rested on his knees. On his short, round body, he wore a close covering, ornamented with small slashes. A short cloak dangled at his back. The collar was cut into curious peaks, which served the goblin in lieu of ruff or neckerchief, and his shoes curled up at the toes into long points. On his head he wore a broad-brimmed sugarloaf hat garnished with a single feather. The hat was covered with white frost, and the goblin looked as if he'd sat on the same tombstone very comfortably for 200 or 300 years. He was sitting perfectly still. His tongue was put out, as if in derision, and he was grinning at Gabriel Grubb with such a grin as only a goblin could call up. "It was not the echoes," said the goblin. Gabriel Grubb was paralyzed and could make no reply. "What do you do here on Christmas Eve?" said the goblin sternly. I came to dig a grave, sir," stammered Gabriel Grubb. "What man wanders among graves and churchyards on such a night as this?" cried the goblin.
"Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!
A wild chorus of voices seemed to fill the churchyard. Gabriel looked fearfully round, but nothing was to be seen. "What have you got in that bottle?" said the goblin. "Gin, sir?" replied the sexton, trembling more than ever, for he had bought it of the smugglers, and he thought that perhaps his questioner might be in the excise department of the goblins. "Who drinks gin alone and in a courtyard on such a night as this?" said the goblin.
"Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!"
exclaimed the wild voices again. "And who then is our fair and lawful prize?" The goblin grinned a broader grin than before and said, "Well, what do you think of this?" The sexton gasped for breath. "What do you think of this, Gabriel?" The goblin kicked up his feet in the air on either side of the tombstone and looked at the turned-up points with as much complacency as if he'd been contemplating the most fashionable pair of Wellingtons in all of Bond Street. It's very curious, sir," replied the sexton, half dead with fright. "Very curious and very pretty. But I think I'll go back and finish my work, sir, if you please." "Work? What work?" said the goblin. "The grave, sir, making the grave," stammered the sexton. "Oh, the grave, eh?" said the goblin. "Who makes graves at a time when all other men are merry and takes a pleasure in it?" Again.
"Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!"
The mysterious voices replied. "I'm afraid my friends want you, Gabriel," said the goblin. "I'm afraid my friends want you, Gabriel." "They don't know me, sir. I don't think the gentlemen have ever seen me, sir." "Oh, yes, they have," replied the goblin. "We know the man with the sulky face and grim scowl who struck the boy tonight because the boy could be merry and he could not. We know him. We know him." Here the goblin gave a loud, shrill laugh, which the echoes returned 20-fold, and throwing his legs up in the air, stood upon his head on the narrow edge of the tombstone, whence he threw a somersault with extraordinary agility right to the sexton's feet. I'm afraid I must leave you, sir," said the sexton. "Leave us?" said the goblin. "Gabriel Grubb going to leave us? Ha, ho, ho!" As the goblin laughed, the sexton observed for one instant a brilliant illumination within the windows of the church, as if the whole building were lighted up. It disappeared. The organ pealed forth a lively air, and the whole troops of goblins poured into the churchyard and began playing at leapfrog over the tombstones. never stopping for an instant to take breath, but overing the highest among them, one after the other, with the most marvelous dexterity. At last, the game reached to a most exciting pitch. The organ played quicker and quicker, and the goblins leaped faster and faster, coiling themselves up, rolling head over heels upon the ground, and bounding over the tombstones like footballs. The sexton's brain whirled round with the rapidity of the motion he beheld, and his legs reeled beneath him as the spirits flew before his eyes, when the Goblin King, suddenly darting towards him, laid his hand upon his collar and sank with him through the earth. When Gabriel Grubb had had time to fetch his breath, which the rapidity of the descent had for the moment taken away, he found himself in what appeared to be a large cavern surrounded by crowds of goblins, ugly and grim. In the center of the room, on an elevated seat, was stationed his friend of the churchyard, King of the Goblins. "Cold tonight," said the king. "Very cold. A glass of something warm here." At his command, half a dozen officious goblins, with a perpetual smile upon their faces, whom Gabriel Grubb imagined to be courtiers on that account, hastily disappeared and presently returned with a goblet of liquid fire, which they presented to the king, whose cheeks and throat were transparent as he tossed down the flame. "Ah, ha, ha, this warms one indeed. Bring a bumper of the same for Mr. Grubb." One of the goblins held him while another poured the blazing liquid down his throat. The whole assembly screeched with laughter as he coughed and choked and wiped away the tears which gushed plentifully from his eyes after swallowing the burning draught. "And now," said the king, "now show the man of misery and gloom a few pictures from our great storehouse." Immediately, a thick cloud which obscured the remoter end of the cavern rolled gradually away and disclosed, apparently at a great distance, a small and scantily furnished but neat and clean apartment. A crowd of little children were gathered round a bright fire, clinging to their mother's gown and gamboling around her chair. The mother occasionally rose and drew aside the window curtain as if to look for some expected object. A frugal meal was ready spread upon the table, and an armchair was placed near the fire. A knock was heard on the door. The mother opened it, and the children crowded round her and clapped their hands for joy as their father entered. He was wet and weary and shook the snow from his garments as the children crowded round him, and seizing his cloak, hat, stick, and gloves with busy zeal, ran with them from the room. Then, as he sat down to the meal before the fire, the children climbed upon his knee, and the mother sat by his side, and all seemed happiness and comfort. But a change came upon the view, almost imperceptibly. The scene was altered to a small bedroom. Here, the fairest and youngest child lay dying. The roses had fled from his cheek, and the light from his eye, and even as the sexton looked upon him with an interest he'd never felt or known before, he died. His young brothers and sisters crowded round his little bed and seized his tiny hand, so cold and heavy, but they shrank back from its touch and looked with awe on the infant's face, for calm and tranquil as it was, and sleeping in rest and peace as the beautiful child seemed to be, they saw that he was dead, and they knew that he was an angel looking down upon them and blessing them from a bright and happy heaven. Again, the light cloud passed over the picture, and again the subject changed. The father and mother were old and helpless now, and the number of those about them was diminished more than half. But content and cheerfulness sat on every face and beamed in every eye as they crowded round the fireside and told and listened to old stories of earlier and bygone days. Slowly and peacefully, the father sank into the grave, and soon after, the sharer of all his cares and troubles followed him to a place of rest. The few who yet survived them kneeled by their tomb and watered the green turf which covered it with their tears, then rose and turned away, sadly and mournfully, but not with bitter cries or despairing lamentations, for they knew that they should one day meet again. The cloud settled upon the picture and concealed it from the sexton's view. "What do you think of that?" said the goblin. It's very pretty," stammered Gabriel Grubb. "You miserable man, you!" The Goblin King administered a good sound kick to Gabriel Grubb, immediately after which all the goblins in waiting crowded round the wretched sexton and kicked him without mercy, according to the established and invariable custom of courtiers upon earth, who kick whom royalty kicks and hug whom royalty hugs. "Show him some more," said the king of the goblins. The cloud was dispelled, and a rich and beautiful landscape was disclosed to view. There is just such another, to this day, within a half-mile of the old abbey town. The sun shone from clear blue sky. The water sparkled beneath its rays. The trees looked greener and the flowers more gay beneath its cheering influence. The water rippled on with a pleasant sound. The trees rustled in the light wind that murmured among their leaves. The birds sang upon the boughs, and the lark caroled on high her welcome to the morning. Yes, it was morning, the bright, balmy morning of summer. The minutest leaf, the smallest blade of grass was instinct with life. The ant crept forth to her daily toil. The butterfly fluttered and basked in the warm rays of the sun. Myriads of insects spread their transparent wings and reveled in their brief but happy existence. Man walked forth, elated with the scene and all the brightness and splendor. "You, a miserable man!" Again, the king of the goblins gave his leg a flourish. Again, it descended on the shoulders of the sexton. And again, the attendant goblins imitated the example of their chief. Many a time, the cloud went and came, and many a lesson it taught to Gabriel Grubb, who, although his shoulders smarted with pain from the frequent applications of the goblin's feet, looked on with an interest that nothing could diminish. He saw that men who worked hard and earned their scanty bread with lives of labor were cheerful and happy, and that to the most ignorant, the sweet face of nature was a never-failing source of cheerfulness and joy. He saw that those who bore in their hearts an inexhaustible wellspring of affection and devotion were the oftenest superior to sorrow, adversity, and distress. Above all, he saw that men like himself, who snarled at the mirth and cheerfulness of others, were the foulest weeds on the fair surface of the earth. And setting all the good of the world against the evil, he concluded that it was the very decent and respectable sort of world after all. No sooner had he formed it than the cloud which had closed over the last picture seemed to settle on his senses and lull him to repose. One by one, the goblins faded from his sight, and as the last one disappeared, he sank to sleep. The day had broken when Gabriel Grubb awoke and found himself lying at full length on the flat gravestone in the churchyard, with the wicker bottle lying empty by his side, and his coat, spade, and lantern, all well whitened by last night's frost, scattered on the ground. The stone on which he had first seen the goblin seated stood bolt upright before him, and the grave at which he'd worked the night before was not far off. At first he began to doubt the reality of his adventures, but the acute pain in his shoulders when he attempted to rise assured him that the kicking of the goblins was certainly not a dream. Gabriel Grubb got to his feet as well as he could for the pain in his back, and brushing the frost off his coat, put it on and turned his face towards town. But he was an altered man, and he could not bear the thought of returning to a place where his repentance would be scoffed at and his reformation disbelieved. He hesitated for a few minutes and then turned away to wander where he might and seek his bread elsewhere. There are a great many speculations about the sexton's fate at first, but it was speedily determined that he'd been carried away by the goblins, and there were not wanting some very credible witnesses who had distinctly seen him whisk through the air on the back of a chestnut horse, blind of one eye, in the hindquarters of a lion, and the tail of a bear. At length, all this was devoutly believed, and the new sexton used to exhibit to the curious, for a trifling emolument, a good-sized piece of the church weathercock, which had been accidentally kicked off the aforesaid horse in his aerial flight and picked up by himself in the churchyard. Unfortunately, these stories were somewhat disturbed by the unlooked-for reappearance of Gabriel Grubb himself some 10 years afterwards, a ragged, contented, rheumatic old man. He told his story to the clergyman and also to the mayor, and in time it began to be received as a matter of history, in which form it was continued down to this very day. Be the matter how it may, as Gabriel Grubb was afflicted with rheumatism to the end of his days, the story has at least one moral, if it teach no better one, and that is that if a man turns sulky and drink by himself at Christmas time, he may make up his mind to be not a bit the better for it, let the spirits be ever so good as those which Gabriel Grubb saw in the Goblin's Cavern.
Stranger's hand I turn away, lay my weary
could be your own.